Hello, welcome to the Address of Fear. If you love horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you're ready, let's get started. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in Milwaukee, America. His family had been in turmoil before and after his birth. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was a chemistry professor who dedicated most of his time to his job, while his mother, Joyce Dahmer, suffered from psychological issues, adding to the household's unrest. Both parents were struggling with their own problems, creating an environment that was especially difficult for Jeffrey. The emotional void in the family became a traumatic experience for young Jeffrey. As a child in need of love and careful guidance, he was abandoned to loneliness due to his mother's depression and his father's indifference. Dahmer's childhood from the outside seemed like a typical one, but it was in these years that the foundations for his horrific crimes were laid. From a young age, loneliness became his greatest enemy. Dahmer was often alone at home or walking to school by himself. His struggles to build social relationships made him more reclusive and silent. In particular, at school, he had great difficulty connecting with other children and was often excluded. Over time, he began to be labeled as weird by his peers, and his isolation forced him to confront the dark thoughts building inside him. The loneliness of his childhood led to the development of dangerously twisted fantasies in Dahmer's mind. From a young age, he had an interest in animals, which slowly turned into a perverse desire to kill. In the backyard of his family's home, he would find dead animals, hide them, and dismember them, an activity that turned into a strange obsession. This marked his first encounter with the thought of killing a living creature. However, this animal-killing act was just the beginning. As his fantasies of harming animals grew, this depravity became entrenched in his psychological world. Yet, Dahmer's childhood began, like many others, quite innocently. However, the lack of proper guidance and affection for a child can sometimes cause dark thoughts to take root. Growing up in an indifferent family environment, where love and attention were scarce, deepened his internal emptiness. A child who receives love from their family grows up with feelings of trust and safety, but Dahmer's family only provided him with pain and loneliness. His father, Lionel, was constantly focused on his job. He was successful in his professional life, but had a weak relationship with his family. Lionel could only offer logical advice to his son, but was indifferent to his emotional needs. Dahmer's mother, Joyce, on the other hand, was psychologically disturbed and was constantly angry and depressed. Her mental state had a profound impact on the entire family dynamic. Joyce's depression and her constantly angry outbursts left a deep impression on young Dahmer. He tried everything to gain her attention and affection, but he never received the attention he longed for. Dahmer would not fully realize the deep scars these childhood traumas left on his personality in the years to come. Instead, he was left to face his dark inner emptiness, finding solace in his twisted thoughts. His early fascination with animals and his urge to harm them only deepened over time. Killing animals became a way for him to temporarily escape from the real world and fill the void of his loneliness and psychological emptiness. However, these behaviors were only the beginning. Dahmer's mental world would become even darker, and his killing would not be limited to animals. Instead, he would target humans and begin a horrifying string of crimes. What began with killing animals would soon escalate to taking human lives. As Dahmer slowly transformed into a monster, no one saw the dark power growing within him. This dark beginning laid the foundation for the horrific crimes he would commit in the future. Jeffrey Dahmer's childhood is not just an example of how a person's dark side is shaped, but also a chilling reminder of how traumas like loneliness and neglect can transform someone into a monster. Dahmer began his dark journey by killing animals, but it would ultimately lead to his twisted obsession with murdering people and dismembering their bodies. This was the dark beginning of his life, and unfortunately, it would ignite a story that would horrify all of America. As a young man, Dahmer began to confront the dark thoughts building inside him. The childhood traumas, loneliness, and neglect left deep marks on his soul. The emotional void in his family, a friendless youth, and a sense of being an outcast allowed terrifying thoughts to flourish within Dahmer. This became a turning point that would not only end the lives of others, but also establish a horrific connection with death, causing him to see people as mere objects within his body. In the early years of his youth, Dahmer began to realize the depth of his dark thoughts. The world around him appeared meaningless and disconnected. His struggles, with relationships both at school and at home, gradually closed him off from others. The hopes and expectations that other young people had for life were foreign to Dahmer. His world became one that was solely concerned with death and control, dark and perverse. Any connection he had with others was mostly broken and superficial. Dahmer was never truly loved or accepted. The loneliness and uncontrollable desires growing inside him would drag him down an even darker path. Dahmer's mental world, especially influenced by his sexual desires, became increasingly complex. His search for sexual identity and the accompanying frustrations began to serve as a tool for him to commit his crimes. Dahmer struggled to control his sexual urges, but instead tried to deal with them through fantasies that merged with violence and death. Gaining complete control over other people seemed to provide him with satisfaction. In his youth, his sexual attraction to men became intertwined with the loneliness and insecurity he felt in life, becoming even more complicated. His sexual urges gradually became sadistic, one of the most significant factors influencing his choice of victims. As Dahmer fed his horrifying desires, he began to project them onto the world around him. His quest for control, particularly over young men, pushed him to refine the methods he used to commit murder. Dahmer would first lure his victims in a seemingly sympathetic way, then reveal the monster inside him. For him, it was not just a murder, but a form of dominance, a desire to possess his victims fully and punish them with death. The violence he inflicted on his victims was a direct reflection of his desire for sexual control. Each victim became a figure in a game played in his twisted mind. This traumatic and complex emotional journey through childhood and adolescence led Dahmer to form a perverse connection with death in his mind. Death became not only an escape but also a means to obtain control, a way to satisfy his yearning for power. His anger toward the living, towards the movement and thought of other people, led him to believe that death was the ultimate and final solution. The horrific bond he formed with death would turn him into not only a killer but also an experimental psychopath. These perverse fantasies became even darker over time. Dahmer not only killed his victims but also sought to dismember them, trying to achieve control over a dead body. The human body was no longer just a tool, it became an object for him. His victims' corpses transformed into objects to satisfy both his sexual desires and his thoughts about death, turning Dahmer into both a monstrous and perverse criminal. For Dahmer, the act of killing was not just a physical crime, but also a psychological escape. Each time he killed, he felt as if he briefly filled the horrific emptiness inside him. Death gave him the sensation of controlling and separating himself from the world. However, with each victim, another piece of him was lost in his terrifying world. As Dahmer continued to maintain this dark connection with death and his victims, he fully succumbed to the monster within him. During this time, Dahmer's crimes became more systematic. He carefully planned each murder and calculated every step. Each murder was a precursor to a more horrific one. Dahmer was not just a killer, but also a psychological reflection of his obsession with death and control. The violence combined with his sexual desires gradually transformed him from an ordinary person into a dark creature. These dark thoughts, which began in his youth and gradually became more brutal, paved the way for his horrific crimes. The dark and perverse thoughts growing inside Dahmer sought escape from the real world, control, and power. The void inside him grew with every murder, and he was approaching a point of no return. This turning point in Dahmer's life was much more than just becoming a killer. Through the dark connection he formed with death, he was transforming into the monster within. Jeffrey Dahmer's dark journey began with his first murder in 1978. The perverse thoughts and desires that had been growing inside him until then finally turned into a concrete action. His first victim was an 18-year-old young man named Stephen Hicks. Hicks was merely the first of Dahmer's dark plans. But this murder marked the beginning of Dahmer's transformation into a killer. The sadistic desires he had been harboring up to that point turned into reality, making Dahmer a ruthless murderer. Dahmer, in fact, wasn't just thinking of committing a murder. For him, it was a form of gaining identity, satisfying his desires, and filling the emptiness inside him. When he met Stephen Hicks, he first tried to approach him in a friendly manner, hoping to lure him into a trap. Like many criminals, Dahmer knew how to make his victim feel safe at first and find their vulnerabilities. After chatting for a while, Hicks invited Dahmer to his home. This was the perfect opportunity for Dahmer to execute his plan. The young man accepted the invitation and headed to Dahmer's home, unaware that he was stepping into a death trap. Once Hicks arrived at Dahmer's house, they spent some time together. However, the perverse desires rising inside Dahmer led him to lose control quickly. His dark thoughts brought him to a breaking point. Suddenly, Dahmer grabbed a hammer and struck Hicks in the head. In that moment, rather than witnessing a person's death, Dahmer decided to carry out his planned action of killing him. After Hicks's death, one of Dahmer's most horrifying steps began: dismembering and hiding the body. Hicks's death was a turning point for Dahmer. After committing the murder, Dahmer first proceeded to dismember the body. The brutal mutilation of the corpse completely erased any remaining limits in Dahmer's twisted journey. After committing murder, processing the victim's body became a way for Dahmer to fill the emptiness inside him and satisfy his desires. Dismembering and hiding the body wasn't just an action for Dahmer. It also created a sense of possession and control. Each piece of the body filled the psychological void inside him a little more, transforming him into a darker version of himself. Eating part of the body reinforced Dahmer's feeling of survival, both physically and psychologically. From the moment Dahmer began committing crimes, he was turning into a monster. With each murder, his feelings of control and sadism grew stronger. The torture he inflicted on his victims' bodies was not merely a physical act, but a form of mental and emotional victory. Hiding the bodies, dismembering them, and performing various manipulations on them seemed to temporarily fill the void Dahmer felt inside. But over time, the intensity of his crimes and the violence he committed began to escalate. With each passing day, Dahmer was taking another step on a darker journey. The first murder was just the beginning of his transformation into a monster. With each victim he killed, he also fed the monster inside him. Each killing became more insidious and calculated than the last. The murders kept coming, and Dahmer's soul was being dragged deeper into an ever-expanding void. The murder of Hicks marked the first step of Dahmer's dark desire. But for him, this was only the beginning. He wasn't just taking a life. He was also processing a human body, satisfying every form of power he craved. This first murder was just the start of the crimes Dahmer would commit. His obsession with his victims' bodies, the violence he inflicted on them, and his deepening dark desires revealed the dangerous psychological profile he possessed. With this first murder, Dahmer solidified his horrific connection to death and began committing his crimes more recklessly. With every person he killed, a little more of his soul was lost. The murders were committed to satisfy a need and to fill the void in his soul. Dahmer's darkness transformed him into a killer, but also a death machine. Each murder dragged him further into a point of no return. After Dahmer began killing, the relationship he had with his victims' bodies started to delve into horrifying depths, not just physically, but also mentally and emotionally. For him, murders were not just crimes. They were expressions of his desire for ownership over his victims. Dismembering and hiding the bodies gradually became a ritual for Dahmer, with the moment when a human life ended bringing him a terrible sense of satisfaction and power. However, this process not only provided satisfaction but also deepened Dahmer's psychological darkness. The bodies became objects to him, ones he could use to fulfill his perverse desires and complete his lost identity. This strange relationship was turning him into a dangerous monster. Dahmer's fascination with his victims, particularly his relationship with their bodies, grew increasingly bizarre over time. After committing his murders, the bond he formed with the bodies was an expression of his desire for control and possession. Dismembering the bodies and then hiding them became a search for perfection in Dahmer's mind. His treatment of the Otzi bodies and the way he chose to preserve them seemed to alleviate his deep sense of emptiness, loneliness, and insecurity, even if only temporarily. Dahmer's crimes were not just driven by sadism or sexual urges. The bodies themselves were symbols of the power he felt. Each body was a reflection of his psychological desire for control. The strange relationship Dahmer formed with the bodies turned them into objects. Each piece of the body went beyond just being a dead corpse. It became a tool for his abstract sense of possession. The time he spent with the bodies began to take the shape of a dark ritual. His obsession with the bodies symbolized his desire for control, and with each person he killed, he delved deeper into his own dark world. Preserving and processing the bodies seemed to fill his inner emptiness, but in reality, with each murder, that emptiness only grew. Like many killers, Dahmer formed strange relationships with the bodies of his victims after killing them. The act of preserving the bodies, dismembering them, and carrying out violent acts on them did more than just satisfy his urge to kill. It led him further down a darker path. The time spent with the bodies offered him a brief respite from loneliness and emptiness. However, this relationship was becoming more and more perverse over time. The bodies of his victims were treated almost like toys, manipulated by Dahmer's dark desires. With every person he killed, the demon inside him grew stronger. The meaning of the bodies in Dahmer's world was far deeper. The tortures he inflicted on them and the relationship he developed by preserving the bodies symbolized his perverse desires towards the dead. Seeing the bodies temporarily alleviated his sense of loneliness and made him feel powerful. For Dahmer, the bodies of his victims represented the acceptance, power, and satisfaction he sought from others. Unfortunately, this process only pushed him further into a deep psychological void. This strange relationship wasn't limited to the bodies alone. Dahmer often tortured his victims, using them as a form of art, asserting his power over them. His interest in the bodies showed that he didn't just see the murders as a means to satisfy his desires. He also viewed them as a form of psychological fulfillment and degradation. Preserving the bodies, possessing them, and dismembering them further solidified the dark thoughts in his mind. Each victim became a collection piece to Dahmer. Each one reinforced his horrifying desires and the murders he committed. His relationship with the bodies showed how Dahmer transformed into a monster and deepened his already dark world. Dahmer's relationship with the bodies turned him into an even more dangerous killer over time. On one hand, his perverse interest in the bodies, and on the other, turning them into objects, deepened the psychological darkness within him. While each body seemed to temporarily fill the emptiness inside him, it ultimately left him more isolated and psychologically darker. His horrifying relationships with the bodies revealed how deeply he touched the darkest, most terrifying corners of the human soul. Jeffrey Dahmer's horrific murders continued until 1991. However, one of his victims finally found an opportunity to escape and inform the police. This was the beginning of Dahmer's end. One of his victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape from Dahmer's house and told the police about the terrible assault he had endured. Edwards detailed the horrifying things he had witnessed at Dahmer's house and even directed them to the rooms where the bodies were hidden. This critical moment led to the end of Dahmer's murders and the revelation of all his crimes. The police, following the information provided by Tracy Edwards, raided Dahmer's house. Upon entering the house, the scene they encountered led them to uncover evidence of one of America's most horrific crimes. Every room in the house bore the traces of Dahmer's terrifying crimes: dismembered bodies, bones stored in bags, horrifying photographs and videos, all indicated that Dahmer's murders had spanned over a long and horrifying period. As the police searched every corner of the house, they found multiple pieces of evidence confirming Dahmer's horrific crimes. The search of Dahmer's house revealed the meticulously planned traces of a murder spree. The heads, hands, and feet of the bodies were kept together, dismembered body parts seemingly turned into a collection. In the photographs found in Dahmer's house, his relationship with the bodies and his terrifying actions were clearly depicted. The tortures he inflicted on the bodies and the dismemberment processes were filled with evidence of the deep psychological darkness he harbored. The police immediately arrested Dahmer, and with the evidence found at his house, the charges against him quickly multiplied. Initially, Dahmer remained silent about his crimes, but eventually, he confessed to all the murders. He provided the number of victims, revealed their identities, and gave detailed information about how the murders were committed. Dahmer's confessions shocked all of America. He openly explained the reasons behind his murders and the psychological motivations driving them. Dahmer admitted that during his horrific crimes, he felt like a monster, and that killing his victims gave him a sense of power. Dahmer's crimes caused nationwide outrage. The murders he committed not only took the lives of his victims, but also revealed a horrific truth that threatened the safety of the American public. Dahmer had designed his violence, sadism, and desire for control over the human body like a game, successfully concealing it for years. However, in the end, his terrifying dark world came to an end, and his punishment became inevitable. In 1992, Dahmer was brought to trial and tried for the murders he committed. The trial became one of the most horrific and attention-grabbing cases in America. Dahmer's defense lawyers argued that his mental state was impaired, and therefore he could not fully take responsibility for his crimes. However, the court determined that Dahmer's crimes were systematic and conscious, and merely attributing them to a mental illness was insufficient. As a result, in 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to life in prison. This sentence was the heaviest punishment for his murders and horrific crimes. However, Dahmer's life in prison, like the lives of his victims, was heading toward a tragic end. In prison, Dahmer's crimes and his guilt became a frequent topic of discussion among guards and other inmates. Sadly, Dahmer's life in prison would not last long. By 1994, Dahmer's life in prison came to an end. Another inmate attacked and killed him. In 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by another inmate in prison. This killing was a horrifying reminder of how Dahmer's crimes and how he existed as a killer in the world tragically came to an end. His tragic end in prison could, in a sense, be seen as revenge for his most horrific murders. Jeffrey Dahmer's murders have gone down in history as a terrifying reflection of the deepest, darkest corners of the human soul. The crimes he committed not only took the lives of his victims, but also exposed the dark side of society and human nature. Dahmer turned his desire to kill, his tortures, and his bizarre obsession with the human body into a display of power and a tool for control. However, in the end, the consequences of these horrific crimes led to a terrible fate for him in prison, showing the world how such psychological darkness can transform into an uncontrollable monster. Jeffrey Dahmer was killed in 1994 by an inmate in prison. However, even after his death, his name continued to echo around the world. His story became more than just the horrific murders he committed. It became a journey into the darkest corners of the human soul. Through his horrifying actions, Dahmer etched his name into history, but this legacy turned into a painful and terrifying inheritance for humanity. Dahmer's death, although it appeared to be the end of his tragic life, the echoes of his murders and horrors continued to be a major topic of discussion in America. His death in prison meant the end of his crimes, but what remained were only the memories of the murders he committed and the terrifying truths behind each of them. Dahmer had caused endless pain to the families of his victims, taking the lives of many innocent people. However, this tragedy also brought to light another crucial reality connected to Dahmer's personality and past. Dahmer was not just a criminal, he was also a reflection of a societal problem. Dahmer's past is a complex story of how a criminal is shaped and how one turns into a horrific monster. Jeffrey Dahmer was once an ordinary child. However, the traumas he experienced in his past, such as loneliness, exclusion, and emotional neglect, led him down this dark path. His parents' divorce and his father's indifference, his mother's psychological issues, left deep scars that contributed to the emotional wounds Dahmer carried. The trauma he experienced during his childhood, his early signs of deviance such as harming animals, gradually escalated into something far more severe and horrifying. Dahmer turned to murder and torture to cope with his inner emptiness. He was a lost soul, and ultimately, this lost soul continued to exist by killing people and subjecting them to terrible tortures. The crimes Dahmer committed not only reflected his psychological breakdown, but also showed how vulnerable society and the system were. Dahmer remained undetected for years, successfully hiding his murders. This revealed the horrifying gaps in America's justice system and societal structure. The period before Dahmer's crimes were exposed demonstrated how easily society could ignore criminals. Dahmer lived as an ordinary person. No one could see the terror he carried inside. However, the horrific fates of his victims clearly revealed what a great danger he posed to society. Dahmer's murders and his relationship with his victims proved just how dark his inner world was. His strange relationship with the bodies gave him a sense of power and control. His perverse world not only normalized the crimes he committed, but also provided him with a strange sense of satisfaction. Hiding the bodies, dismembering them, and turning them into objects was not just a horrifying game for Dahmer, but also an expression of his desire to dominate the world. This reflected his psychological darkness and his bizarre fascination with the human body. However, Dahmer's death was not the end of his terror. His story continued to leave deep scars on society. Many people, studying his crimes and psychological state, tried to understand the reasons behind his horrifying actions. While Dahmer had somehow exposed the depth and horror of his guilt, his emptiness and loneliness allowed for some empathy from others. People realized that the trauma and emotional void Dahmer experienced played a role in turning him into a killer. Yet this did not mean his crimes were forgivable. Dahmer was not only a psychopath but also a human who had transformed into a monster due to societal structures and personal trauma. Dahmer's life offers many lessons from psychological, socio-cultural, and societal perspectives. His story is a tragic example of how psychopathy, societal neglect, and a person's inner darkness can intersect. Even after his death, Dahmer's actions served as a reminder of the deep psychological issues he faced, and how society's failure to address individual needs could lead to devastating consequences. Ultimately, Jeffrey Dahmer was not only a killer, but also a horrifying example of how a society can enlarge an individual's emotional and psychological voids, fueling their dark desires and impulses. His story became not only a terrifying criminal figure, but also an insight into psychological trauma and the darker sides of human nature. While Dahmer's death marked the end of his horrific legacy, the impact he left on the world remains unforgettable.